It's my great pleasure to introduce to you this morning Rod as he continues with this fascinating series on battleships. Thank you, Rod. We look forward to this presentation.
Thank you, Tisha. Welcome to episode 2 of the story of battleships, where we're going to run really from where we left off last week at the Battle of Trafalgar. After the Battle of Trafalgar, you will remember that the Royal Navy's supremacy of the seas of the world was pretty much unchallenged. Napoleon abandoned plans to invade Britain and never revived them. The French, having, by the time they got back to Cadiz, there were only about 10 serviceable ships left in that fleet. They did, however, embark on a ferocious building program aimed at getting back to 150 battleships. By 1814, however, at the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon was defeated on land, so the Navy became irrelevant. During the War of 1812, there's a little bit of, we need to understand a bit of that. The Americans make a lot of noise about giving the Royal Navy a bloody nose at the battle in the War of 1812, when the UK fought America over issues around Canada. In fact, yes, the USA scored some successes against slower and undergunned Royal Navy frigates, but no battleships were sent to that conflict at all. USA had none. Royal Navy at the time of 1812 had 130 battleships, between 60 and 120 gunners, and 600 frigates. The USA had 7 frigates, so there wasn't really an issue. There is an evolution that runs during the 19th century. The first thing that happened was the French stuck some boilers and a screw at the bottom of one of their ships, and this is Napoleon, which was commissioned in 1852. The Royal Navy commissioned HMS Victoria shortly thereafter and looked very similar to that. Then the French built 10 of these steam-powered wooden battleships and converted another 28 existing battleships. The Royal Navy, not to be outdone, built 18 and converted 41. They didn't live long. Next up, we had ironclads. HMS Warrior, she was featured last week, we talked about her. She's in dry dock close to HMS Victory in Portsmouth currently. 10 years later, she was commissioned, and you can see she was an ironclad warship. She still carried a generous sail plan, and she carried 40 68-pounders. That's a serious gun. HMS Devastation was the first battleship that carried its main armament on top, mounted on its deck rather than inside it. She was commissioned in 1871. It's got the good old 2 12-inch guns, each in 2 turrets, so a total of 4 12-inch guns. They were initially muzzle loaders. In 1891, they refitted her and gave her better boilers and breech-loading guns. She was actually not a bad ship. At 10 knots cruising speed, she could do 10,000 kilometers. And had a crew of 300 odd and enough food and grog for 6 weeks, a 6-week voyage. We then get quite a step change into what starts to look like a proper battleship. This is what became known as a PreDreadnought. Obviously, it wasn't called a PreDreadnought at the time. It was a battleship, a seagoing battleship. They were driven by triple expansion steam engines and carried main battery of heavy guns, typically 4 12-inches, or sometimes 13 inches. They were centrally mounted with fully armored turrets. We're now really looking like a battleship. At this time, important to know that black powder as the propellant for your projectile gave way to nitrocellulose and cordite, which is a slower burning explosive. It's a deflagration rather than a detonation. Now, there's a subtle difference in it. They still make a bang, but it allows for a longer barrel to give the projectile time to get up to speed and giving a higher muzzle velocity and better range. The Royal Navy at this time was subject to what they call the Naval Defence Act in 1889, which mandated that the Royal Navy had to have sufficient battleships that were more than the combined strength of the next two biggest navies in the world. That was their mandate to build them. The Royal Navy at this time built 53 what we would call PreDreadnought battleships in 11 classes between the years 1892 and 1904. So in 12 years, they built 53 of these things. They all had main armament of 4 large guns. The smaller ones displaced 10 to 12,000 tons and larger classes nearly 18,000. The German Navy was now entering the arms race, and they also started building. And they commissioned 24 battleships during the pre-Dreadnought era. So there was a full-blown arms race in battleships going on. The US Navy also got in on the act and commissioned 25 battleships between 1895 and 1906. So yeah, battleship building it was the equivalent of the nuclear arms race really at that time. The British shipyards also built a lot of ships for Imperial Japanese Navy, at which I think 10 battleships were ordered from British shipyards and heavy cruisers. They pretty much annihilated the Russian fleet at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905. I know you've heard of that battle. The Russians didn't really come home from that. Then in 1906, this was laid down. Now, this is HMS Dreadnought. This is the game changer. And this rendered all existing battleships obsolete. She was the brainchild of Admiral Jackie Fisher. When appointed First Sea Lord, he ordered a design for a battleship that had all 12-inch guns. Now you can see HMS Dreadnought has a rather unusual turret positioning where she's got 2 beam turrets here in the middle, 1 turret in the bow and 2 in the stern, a total of 10 12-inch guns. She had a speed of 21 knots, sharply faster than the pre-Dreadnought battleships that could manage about 14. She was the first capital ship in the world to be powered by steam turbines and was certainly the fastest battleship in the world. Her Parsons turbines were driven by 18 Babcock and Wilcox coal-fired boilers. You can imagine the army of stokers required to keep them going. She generated 17,000 kilowatts of shaft horsepower. This really was a revolutionary ship. She was small by the standards of later battleships, but 160 meters overall, displacing around 20,000 tons. Crew complement initially 700, going up to 800 during wartime. You can see the sailor here standing on the main deck. You see him there. You can see it's a big ship, but it's not that big. But that's HMS Dreadnought. She had a fairly undistinguished career. She's the only battleship ever to have sunk a submarine deliberately. She rammed it. She was built, however, in record time. That's the thing about Dreadnought. She was built in the Royal Navy dockyard, Portsmouth. And instead of their usual 48-hour week, the workmen were required to work a 12-hour day, 6 days a week, 72-hour week. And she was launched by Edward VII on the 10th of February 1906, after only 4 months from being laid down. She was completed 9 months later. So she was reported to have cost £1.7 million at the time, 200 million in today's money. She was commissioned into the fleet in December 1906, a mere 15 months after being laid down. So that really shook the navies of the world. Royal Navy's first nuclear submarine in 1960 was called HMS Dreadnought. The lead ship of the latest class of Trident nuclear missile submarines is also HMS Dreadnought. And at 17,000 tons, the new HMS Dreadnought is nearly as big as namesake. And she's a little more expensive, however. It's reported to have cost £200 billion for the Trident submarine, and that excludes the cost of the missiles and the warheads. And that information is classified, obviously. During the war that followed, which we're going to have a bit of a look at in a minute, Churchill took a fateful decision. had an impact on world politics for many years thereafter to convert the Royal Navy's warships from coal fire to oil fire. A very big and quite courageous decision. Britain had no oil. It all came from the Middle East. They had huge supplies of their own coal. They had coaling stations all over the world. It really was the go-to fuel. However, the deciding factor was speed. Him and Jackie Fisher, who had retired but was retained as a consultant to Churchill at the time of the First World War, when Churchill was First Sea Lord, decided that they needed ships that could do 24 knots to be able to outrun the battleships of the Imperial German Navy. He then bought 51% of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. He also established the Iraq Petroleum Company, which was wholly British owned, and did a deal with Shell so that oil supplies were guaranteed. And the impact of that has, as we know, an effect on Middle Eastern politics henceforth. These are the Queen Elizabeth class battleships, the first to be wholly oil-fired. And you'll see another advantage of oil was it didn't make as much smoke. You can see there's hardly any smoke coming out of her stacks. Not that she's going particularly quickly, but compare that with Dreadnought, which was a smoky old thing. Did I show you? Remember how much smoke coming out of Dreadnought? This was HMS Queen Elizabeth, who does feature in the Battle of Jutland. When hostilities started in 1914, I'm just going to run you quickly through how many battleships the various navies had. The Royal Navy had in commission 42 pre-dreadnoughts, 24 dreadnoughts at the outbreak of war, plus another 10 super dreadnoughts, one of which was HMS Queen Elizabeth, that were commissioned during the war. The French Navy had 20 pre-dreadnoughts, 5 dreadnoughts, plus 3 super dreadnoughts they commissioned during the war. The Imperial German Navy had 22 pre-dreadnoughts and 17 dreadnoughts at the outbreak of war. They only managed to commission 2 more during the war. At this point, I'd like us to have a bit of a look at the business part of these ships. Why are they there? They're there because of these guns. Now you can see the turret. All you can see of this gun is really, you can see its turret. You can see it's an armored turret and it rotates. That's all you can really see. This is actually what it looks like and how it works. You can see this little graphic now shows the shell being loaded in, then the bags of cordite into the working chamber, gets pushed into the gun loading cage, and it gets rammed into the gun, and the gun shoots. To go through this in a little more detail, I'm going to show you a little movie which shows exactly how it happens. Let me just give you some stats on one of these guns. The length of the barrel is described as a 42 caliber. Now, 42 caliber means the length is 42 times the diameter of the charge, 42 times the caliber. Now, if it's a 15-inch shell, the 42 calibers would have a barrel of 630 inches, which is around 16 meters in our money. The shell of a 15-inch gun weighs 875 kilograms. Its muzzle velocity is 750 meters a second. Those cordite bags you saw weigh 50 kilos each, and they are manhandled. Obviously, a projectile can't be manhandled, it has to be using a hoist. One of these turrets, 15-inch turrets with 2 guns, required 63 men to operate it. So first you have, as we saw, you have to put the projectile and your cordite charges onto the hoist, up to the working chamber, gets rammed into the loading cage, and this we'll see what happens next. Here is the breech of the 15-inch gun. It has to be opened. Pull that lever. Unlocks the breech. It's a sort of half screw arrangement that tightens it down. They have a blowing system to blow out the crud from the previous firing. here comes the loading cage up from the working chamber, and there's a ram that pushes the projectile down the barrel. Then it pushes the first lot of cordite bags and the next lot of cordite bags. There you go, ready to go. The loading cage goes back down to the working chamber. This little thing, that little thing that went in there, that's called the vent tube. That's what actually fires it. It's a bit like a big shotgun cartridge. Okay, lock the breech and lay the gun. Gun ready. There she is. In the conflict between the Royal Navy and the High Seas Fleet during World War I, this is really the sphere of operations. The Royal Navy Grand Fleet is located here in the northwest corner of your map, top left-hand corner, the islands of Orkney that lie off the north coast of Scotland. And this little cluster of islands around the south side of Orkney is called Scapa Flow. It's a very big natural harbour, and that is where the Grand Fleet was based. They also had a base here in Moray Firth, and they had a base in Rosyth, which is sort of the other side of the Firth of Forth from Edinburgh. And with their capital ships, they maintained a blockade essentially between a line between the Firth of Forth and Stavanger in Norway. North of that, you could call that the Royal Navy's Sea. They also blockaded in the Straits of Dover, and the French were blockading the western approaches to the Channel. The German High Seas Fleet operated out of Wilhelmshaven, which is down here in the Heligoland Bight. That was the main German Imperial Navy base. The Germans' strategy was to try and loosen the blockade of the Royal Navy, and they had an idea that if they could get the Grand Fleet out and engage them on their own terms and sufficiently damage them that maybe they could loosen this blockade and start to get convoyed supplies through from the Atlantic. I'm going to show you a video now of what exactly happened on the 31st of May, 1916. Let me show you the characters. The characters involved. On the Royal Navy side, there's Admiral Sir John Jellicoe, officer commanding the Grand Fleet, and his man commanding the battlecruiser squadron, Vice Admiral Sir David Beatty. The High Seas Fleet was commanded by Vice Admiral Reinhard Scheer, and their battlecruisers were commanded by Vice Admiral Franz Hipper.
At the end of May 1916, both the British and Germans planned to send a large battle group to a position roughly 80 miles west of the northern tip of Denmark. They each planned a trap for the other. With early but hazy intelligence on the German sortie, the British left harbour first. The British Grand Fleet coming from its northern bases at Scapa Flow and Cromarty, the battle cruisers joining from Rosyth further south. It was a huge force, silently sailing into the night. The British were on a direct collision course with Hipper's scouting group of 5 battle cruisers. They were steaming roughly 60 miles ahead of Scheer and the main battle fleet. Only chance brought the 2 battle cruiser groups together. A small Danish steamer, the NJ Fjord, was seen by each other's scouts. Simultaneously, they went to investigate, and in doing so, fell upon each other, firing what would become the opening shots of the Battle of Jutland. Beatty's ships were faster, they could shoot further and use heavier shell. In his mind, he could easily deal with Hipper's 5 battle cruisers. Beatty was a fox-hunting man and loved the chase. He showed extraordinary courage under fire, but Jellicoe was always concerned with one thing, that Beatty would too easily be pulled into such a trap. Beatty immediately raced south, wanting to cut Hipper off from his route home, but in his haste to close with his adversary, he may have made a mistake. He left behind 4 of the most modern and powerful ships on the sea that day, Rear Admiral Hugh Evan Thomas's 4 15-inch gunned Queen Elizabeth class battleships. A question that was asked, even by many battlecruiser officers, was why Beatty had not opened fire earlier. He had the range advantage, and Hipper had always feared the period when his ships would be in a danger zone, unable to return effective fire, but being hit by British fire. 3:48 on the afternoon of May 31st, Hipper gave the order, open fire. His flagship, the Lutzow, the guns roared. Within 3 salvos, deadly German fire was straddling the British ships, and within 3 minutes, line had been hit twice. Initial British fire badly overshot the German line, maybe because of the bad visibility. British fire allocation had also been badly muddled. Beatty had intended that Lutzow should be targeted by both the Lion and Princess Royal, and that worked. But the Tiger and Queen Mary mistakenly targeted one ship too far back. The second German ship in the line, the Derfflinger, was left totally untargeted. But it was the firing from the Von der Tann that scored the first victory. Her gunnery officer, Marholz, managed to score repeated hits, though he said he could hardly make out the target as she was almost totally covered in splash. After only 13 minutes of battle, the first British ship, the Indefatigable, slid out of line, rolled over and sank. Any survivors didn't last long in the numbingly cold waters of the North Sea. 2 men, later rescued by the Germans, tried in vain to rescue their captain. 25 minutes later, the Queen Mary also fell victim to German guns. She'd only been in service 3 years. The pride of the Royal Navy disappeared in a devastating explosion. A huge mushroom cloud, the only visible evidence that a ship had ever even been there. In less than half an hour, more than 2,000 British sailors lost their lives. In total, there were only 23 survivors from the 2 catastrophic magazine explosions, and only 18 of them from the Queen Mary. The battlecruiser's architect, British Admiral Sir Jackie Fisher, thought the ship's higher speed and greater gunnery range would more than compensate for the relatively light armour protection. At Jutland they were proved wrong, and the results were fatal. Getting the explosive cordite charges from a turret magazine to the guns was exhausting, and under fire, brutally so. The gunners wanted the cordite and shell as fast as possible so they could shoot more quickly. Consequently, cordite bags were dangerously stockpiled around the insides of turrets and passages, and this made the flash-tight doors designed to stop the flames travelling between the turrets and the magazines irrelevant. 2 minutes after the Queen Mary had gone, Lion nearly suffered the same fate. A half hour earlier, her Q turret had been hit, and the top had been blown off. A huge tower of flame now shot skyward. Had the turret still been covered, she would have also blown up. Scouting ahead of the battlecruisers, Goodenough on the Southampton urgently signalled that 16 German dreadnoughts were in sight and closing fast. The British now realised they were heading into a trap. Waiting a few moments to confirm the news, Beatty turned his 4 remaining battlecruisers around, but the 4 accompanying Queen Elizabeth continued southbound into increasingly heavy German fire. Using the same spot around which to turn his ships and reverse course was a mistake. Evan Thomas only made it easier for the German gunners. All they needed to do was to keep their guns trained on the very same spot as the British obligingly steamed into the cauldron of fire. Beatty's ships had been hit badly, after 75 minutes by around 44 heavy caliber shells, and the Germans less than half that amount. After the Queen Mary exploded, Beatty came to an awful conclusion. He turned to his flag captain, Ernie Chatfield, and muttered, "There seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today." Now it was Beatty's fortunes that rose. As the 4 Queen Elizabeths began to move north, shielding his rear, pressure on his own 4 ships was relieved, but damage to the battleships was extensive, even if they dealt out equal punishment. But the British trap nearly wasn't ready at all. Jellicoe only had the roughest idea of the position and course of the 2 German forces. His repeated and increasingly exasperating requests for information were all but ignored by Beatty, who was busy fighting his own battle. 5 minutes before 6, the ships of the Grand Fleet and the battlecruiser fleets were finally able to make each other out in the hazy mist. But crucially, Jellicoe himself still could not see any German ships. The British Commander-in-Chief literally only had minutes in which to decide how to best meet the invisible threat. The timing was critical to avoid his own fleet being caught in the middle of the manoeuvre when most of his firepower could not be brought to bear. Jellicoe deployed the Grand Fleet to port towards the Danish coastline. The fleet literally remodeled itself from 6 parallel lines, each with 4 dreadnoughts, into one continuous line 5.5 miles long, designed to hurl the maximum amount of steel against the enemy. The manoeuvre was brilliant. It blocked Scheer within a semicircle of British guns. And turning so many ships in such little space required extraordinary seamanship. There were close calls, but not one collision amongst the 122 ships' captains. First, the British fleet steered towards Denmark, then turned south to parallel the coast. It might have seemed as though Jellicoe was steaming away from the German fleet, but in fact he was positioning his own fleet more carefully. As Beatty took the line ahead of the Grand Fleet so that he could position his own battle cruisers in the van, Admiral Arbuthnot crossed dangerously close, only getting 2 of his 4 ships through Beatty's own line. The Defence and Warrior headed straight towards the Germans, intent on attacking the cruiser Wiesbaden. Instead, the defence was met with a hail of fire. It exploded in a fireball and sank with all hands. The German ships were now silhouetted against the western setting sun, while Jellicoe's own were almost invisible, lost in a grey murk. The German fleet's direct route home had been cut off by the Grand Fleet, putting themselves in between their opponents and their harbour. The Germans had become increasingly boxed in, first by Beatty in the west, then Jellicoe to the north, and now a new force, Horace Hood's 3rd Battle Cruiser Squadron, to the east. Things started well for Hood. The Invincible went to the rescue of the Chester, where the young, wounded Jack Cornwall continued to man his post on her forward gun. A few days later he would die of his wounds. Posthumously, he would receive the Victoria Cross for his bravery. Invincible's shooting found its mark, mortally damaging one of her aggressors, the Wiesbaden. There was only to be one survivor, the stoker Hugo Zenner, and among the dead was Georg Fock, the much-beloved German poet. Then at 6:30, another huge explosion. Invincible had blown up. All her crew except 6 had gone down with her, and all that was left this time were just the 2 halves, stern and bows, sticking upright out of the shallow waters. At first the British sailors cheered. They thought it was a German wreck, and then they saw her name. 60 meters below, Invincible's aft gun can still be seen, pointing majestically out beneath the cold grey waters of the North Sea. Hipper's ships were out in front of the main battle fleet's dreadnoughts, strung out in a line that was 9 miles long. His leading ships were coming under a terrible and increasing rain of British shells. The range was short, around 10,000 yards, and British shooting was superb. 23 heavy hits in minutes. Jellicoe's own flagship, the Iron Duke, hit the König 7 times in as many minutes. Although, to give you an idea of just how bad the visibility was, Iron Duke's gunnery officer was even nervous at this point about opening fire. He wasn't sure if the ship he saw was an enemy or a friend. Scheer was stunned, but only for a moment. He quickly recovered and ordered a complete turnabout of his battle fleet. Within 4 minutes his ships, now steaming away from Jellicoe, vanished into the mist. Jellicoe was left totally in the dark. None of the captains who'd seen what happened reported anything back to him. The Royal Navy had become victim to its own traditions. Speak only when spoken to, do something only when ordered. This navy was not an easy place for officers with initiative. The British Admiral decided against following Scheer into the mist. He doubted he would catch him. But more important, he was also convinced, some say obsessed, that his ships would steam onto mines laid by the German ships in their wake. In fact, his belief that all German destroyers carried mines was wrong, but his intentions had been laid out and agreed to by the Admiralty 2 years before the battle. Then Scheer surprised Jellicoe a second time. He reversed the previous turn to relaunch another attack of the British line. It seemed like madness. Under intense fire, the front of the German line again buckled, bunching up so badly this time that before Scheer even ordered another turn, the leading ships started to turn independently, so desperate were they to get out from under British fire. Out in front, Hipper's battle cruisers were now in tatters. Only one option seemed open to Scheer: to get his main battle fleet home as fast as possible, and certainly before daylight, and what would undoubtedly be his fleet's annihilation. He now ordered waves of torpedo attacks, and with the command "Ran and find" a charge of the heavily damaged battle cruisers at the British line, no matter what the cost. It was Scheer's only way to cover the escape of the main battle fleet. Scheer knew his opponent and correctly anticipated Jellicoe's next move. the threat was enough for the British Admiral to turn the Grand Fleet away from the swarm of oncoming German torpedoes to try to outrun them. Turning towards the torpedoes would have been exceptionally dangerous. The closing speed alone would have been around 45 miles an hour rather than 5, and the time taken for the complete turn might just have been too long. Not one single one of the 31 torpedoes that eventually reached the British line hit a British ship, though there were many close calls. Jellicoe was, as he knew he would be, widely criticised by much of the press and by the British public, and by many of those in the Admiralty who specifically had approved of his intended actions 2 years earlier, including Churchill, even by Beatty privately. But as Beatty later wrote when he himself was C&C of the British fleet, when you're winning, risk nothing. While Jellicoe only had an inkling where the German fleet was, Beatty signalled that his battlecruisers should take over the lead. At that point, the nearest German ship was probably 9 miles distant. Jellicoe nevertheless followed Beatty's suggestion, ordering Jerram to support him, but Jerram had no idea where Beatty was. Between the two lines of adversary ships, however, were two light cruisers, the Caroline and the Royalist. They could in fact see the Germans, and they promptly engaged. Unluckily, Caroline's torpedo aimed at the battleship Westphalen went right underneath her. British torpedoes were in fact notoriously unreliable. The two light cruisers then requested help, but were turned down. Rear Admiral Jerram was not persuaded that the targets weren't in fact Beatty's. Jerram's actions lost the British 15 minutes of continued action in daylight, and that might not have been decisive in itself, but it might also have very easily cost Scheer another ship or two, so heavily damaged were they by now. At nightfall, both fleets reorganised. Jellicoe wanted to actually avoid a night action. It left too much to chance. Dreadnoughts in his mind were far too vulnerable to short-range torpedo attacks, and German night fighting equipment and experience actually superior to that of the Royal Navy in some critical areas. The smaller guns, the secondary armament on German ships, were directly trained by searchlights that could, one moment, send out a powerful pinpoint light operating with an iris-like shutter, and then, just as fast, completely open up to full illumination for full main battery fire. British searchlights, by comparison, were extremely crude. The British didn't even have star shells, which the Germans did. At this point, there was only one thing that was really on Scheer's mind: to break through the British line and to take his ships to safety, and he had 3 routes to choose from. But to get through, he had first to break through the protective screen of the 58 destroyers that Jellicoe had placed 5 miles behind the Grand Fleet, and Scheer knew about these destroyers from intercepted messages. At 10 p.m, Scheer decided to take the shortest route. He headed southeast for the Horns Reef. Throughout the day, some of the Admiralty signals were quite misleading, making Jellicoe doubtful of subsequent intelligence, starting with the now infamous message stating that Scheer's flagship was still in harbour, and before 5 o'clock that illusion had been shattered. Distrustful of the intelligence he was getting, Jellicoe made up his own mind. He headed direct south to the Jade. What was worse was that none of the signal intercepts that had been decrypted by Room 40, revealing the true destination of the German High Seas Fleet, were passed on. Jellicoe was furious when he found out after the war's end. During the next few hours, there would be 7 separate, unequal but bitterly fought engagements between small British destroyer flotillas and German battleships and their escorts. In one, the British 4th Flotilla lost a full 70% of her ships. One of her destroyers, the 935-ton Spitfire, physically clashing bow to bow with the 20,000-ton Dreadnought, the Nassau. In another engagement, the Rhineland physically sliced a British destroyer in 2. But the British were also able to claim some successes in the night action. A torpedo shot from the British destroyer Onslaught claimed the PreDreadnought, the HMS Pullman. Her secondary armaments magazine caught fire and she exploded in front of the German line with more than 800 deaths. Not one single report of the many flotillas' actions reached the Iron Duke that night. While German Telefunken signals certainly blocked some of the radio reports, most captains did not understand the value of sending back information to the flagship. Eventually the Germans did succeed in punching through the British line, and Jellicoe had no idea that they'd even done so. Despite the many opportunities, the British failed to sink the massively damaged Seydlitz, and the Germans themselves were responsible for scuttling the Lützow. Seydlitz would not rejoin the fleet until mid-September, Derfflinger not until the next month. Jellicoe was ready 4 hours after reaching Scapa, and Tiger, Princess Royal, Barham and Malaya were repaired by July, while each of 5 German battleships needed 50 days of repairs in dock. On the basis of sinking more ships, and because more British sailors died in the battle, the Germans claimed victory. The Kaiser, welcoming the fleet back on the 1st of June, declared that the spirit of Trafalgar and British sea power had finally been destroyed. But to claim any victory, one needs to have achieved one's stated objectives, and the German intentions of ending the British blockade or seriously damaging the Grand Fleet had clearly failed. And although one might say that the German High Seas Fleet fought with great courage and inflicted heavy pain on the Royal Navy, it was not able to again successfully challenge the British and finish what had been started at Jutland. British sea dominance remained intact, and it seemed as if nothing had in fact changed. Except everything. A Pandora's box had in fact been opened by the very success of holding the German fleet at bay. In a secret report to the Kaiser days after the battle, Admiral Scheer wrote that Germany could never win the war by defeating the British fleet at sea. They had to try to defeat Britain economically by cutting the vital supply of materials and food that came to her by sea. That meant that Germany could only hope to win the war by gambling on an aggressive campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare.
So, at the end of the battle, the German High Seas Fleet retires, as we know, to lick its wounds in Wilhelmshaven. It never emerged again. For the next 2 years, 2.5 years in fact, it remained there. At Armistice, Beatty and German High Command had a conference, and it was indicated that the German fleet, the whole of the High Seas Fleet, including destroyers, must sail to Rosyth. And I'm just going to show the humiliation that the Germans suffered at that time. This is the meeting between Beatty on the left here and the German officers on the right.
Back in Germany, disarmament of the ships was carried out at breakneck speed. While ammunition and technical equipment were being offloaded, limited supplies of coal, food and water were taken on for the period of internment, expected to last for only around 36 days. Nobody wanted to give the Allies any excuse to resume hostilities. Finally, the ships were ready. Late in the afternoon of the 17th of November, they set sail for England. Their first port of call, the Grand Fleet's new base in Rosyth. It would be the Imperial Navy's last journey. At Rosyth, the British prepared for the Germans' arrival. Sir David Beatty theatrically set the stage. He wanted the nation, as well as his American allies, to see the enemy's fleet's arrival as decisive as a defeat at sea. The British public's faith in the Royal Navy had been eroded. Jutland had not delivered the long-awaited Trafalgar-like victory for which it had fought, although the German fleet had largely remained bottled up for the remainder of the war. A massive Allied armada, more than 250 ships of war, went out to meet the German ships, to escort them into the Firth of Forth, all under the humiliating gaze of the world's press, for whom the day had been especially staged. No chances were taken. Even the smallest of incidents could be the spark to a disaster. As the German ships neared, the guns on each Allied ship were kept trained and ready to fire on their opposite number. The German Navy has never forgotten Beatty's order that the German flag be lowered at sunset and not raised again without permission. These were, after all, still unsurrendered ships. It was now that the rumour started to go around the ships. They were on their way to Scapa Flow. The huge natural harbour had been the home for the British Grand Fleet for the first 2 years of the war.
The German fleet were assigned anchorages in Scapa Flow, and there was a total of 74 ships, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The conditions, morale and discipline deteriorated badly over the months, and they were kept for months. In theory, the internment awaited the negotiations at Versailles for the German surrender. Though, as we know, the Versailles negotiations dragged on for many, many months. And meanwhile, the fleet languished in Scapa Flow. A good number of the crews were repatriated to Germany, so they were down really to care and maintenance crews. But nonetheless, boredom, bad discipline, it was a shambles. And the commanding officer of the fleet, Admiral Ludwig von Reuter, hatched a plan to scuttle the ships unless the German government agreed to hand them over. The signature of the Treaty of Versailles had been scheduled for the 21st of June, and senior British officers had planned to board the fleet to prevent any attempted scuttling. However, the signing was delayed, and the British left Scapa Flow on a training exercise. This is what happened next.
Orkney, Midsummer's Day 1919, started like any. It would end like no other. As a light breeze gently rippled the waters, and with a clear blue sky overhead, the great battleships of Vice Admiral Fremantle's 1st Battle Squadron put to sea. He'd been asked by the new Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Fleet, Admiral Madden, against his wishes, to complete a torpedo training exercise. Fremantle knew that these final days before the armistice signing could be very dangerous. Just before 11:30, Reuter's signal to scuttle was raised on the Emden. It looked innocent enough. Paragraph 11 bestätigen. Roughly, paragraph 11, confirm. At 12:16, a single bell was heard to toll. As the former flagship PreDreadnought started to list, her bell warned the British of what was happening. It wasn't long before other ships also started to go down. At 12:54, the König Albert, 10 minutes past 1, the first of the battle cruisers Moltke, and 5 minutes later, another battleship, Kronprinz Wilhelm. Within a half hour, she was followed by 5 more battleships: Kaiser, Große Kurfürst, Prinz Regent Luitpold, Kaiserin, and König. And the first light cruiser, Dresden, was followed by 2 others, Brümmer and Köln, just minutes later. 10 minutes before 2, the second battle cruiser, Seydlitz, rolled over onto her starboard side. She looked like a beached whale, and later many visitors would mistake her for the outline of an island. As soon as Reuter's signal was given, sailors started to leave their sinking ships. Very soon, the whole floe was covered with boats and scattered with all manner of flotsam, a scene of chaos against a background of shouts of terror, panic and jubilation, the sound of rushing water, the explosive sounds of ships rolling and sinking, and machinery scraping across decks. As they had no clear line of sight, the destroyers received Reuter's orders much later, but like the bigger ships, they now started to go down. British guard ships darted around, pell-mell, trying to get the crews to go back on board, threatening and machine gunning groups of cowering sailors. The scene on the floe was one of absolute chaos. Strangely, they also seemed to waste time taking down the defiant flags that had been raised. Apparently, symbolism seemed as important to some British officers as keeping the enemy's ships afloat. One by one, boats were collected and the German crews consolidated on the decks of British battleships.
The commanding officer, Admiral later said he couldn't help feeling sympathy for Reuter, who preserved his dignity when placed in a highly unpleasant and invidious position. Several German sailors lost their lives that day due to the attempts of the Royal Navy to get them to go back on board their ship. They were the last German casualties of World War I, and the last of the crews were only actually repatriated eventually in 1920. The French were livid. They, having expected to score a good number of prizes, the British considered it a blessing, however, as it removed the thorny question of the disposal of the ships. The bulk of the fleet sank and was sold to a Scottish entrepreneur by name Ernest Cox, who spent the next 20 years, raised 26 destroyers, 2 battle cruisers and 5 battleships. And the last of them was raised just as the war broke out in 1939. fact, that salvage operation on the island of Orkney saved the Orkney Islanders from all the effects of the depressions in the 1930s. They were probably one of the wealthiest little spots in the whole of the world. There was a remembrance service held on Scapa Flow on the 21st of June 2019, which was attended by the grandson and 3 great-grandsons of the Duke von Reuter. And that's the end of the story of the battleships of the First World War. Anyway, thank you. Any questions?
Was there no such thing as accurate weather reports before the Battle of Jutland? Because really, the positioning of the ships and the whole approach to the battle was reliant on visibility. And the Brits actually, in first, sitting targets. Germans had the sun behind them, or what sun there was.
The weather forecasting in 1916, I don't know how good it was. I think it pretty much relied on reports from the so-called coastal stations. Anybody ever listen to the shipping forecast on BBC Radio 4? I love it. Absolutely love it. They've still got it, and it's exactly the same there. They go Shannon, Rockall, Bailey, 5 moderating 3, 18 miles, fine. That's the shipping forecast for parts of the North Sea. Look, it was midsummer, for heaven's sake. It should have been reasonably okay, but it's the North Sea. The North Sea is always miserable. Has anybody ever sailed in the North Sea? It's a terrible cold place, isn't it? Anyway, thank you.